This is a short presentation, less than 15 minutes, focusing upon Ruth and Ann Ruth Mason, who were the wife and daughter of Miles Mason, the well-known ceramics manufacturer in North Staffordshire. I chose to focus on Ruth and Ann Ruth Mason because of this family portrait and oil painting that hangs in the Raven Mason collection at Keele University, and it depicts Miles Mason on the left, his wife Ruth, their eldest child Ann Ruth, and three sons, William, George Miles and Charles James Mason. There's much more known about Miles and his three sons because they were engaged in the pottery industry, but we know very little about Ruth and Ann Ruth, what happened to them, what their fate was, and whether they were involved in the industry at all. Miles Mason went to London early in his life. He was born in 1752 in what became Cumbria, and he went to live in Essex with a relative to seek his fortune in London. When he was there, he became acquainted with Richard Farrer, a very well-known and well-established dealer, a retailer and wholesaler in ceramics and glass, and principally the goods that had been imported by the East India Company. He had a very eminent position in Fenchurch Street for his retail premises. He had shipping interests at Queenhithe on the Thames and in Liverpool. Ruth Mason was the sole heir of Richard Farrer's business, and she was 9 years old when she lost her father and the fortune in the business passed to her. Miles Mason was perhaps ambitious enough to see that marrying an heiress might benefit his business interests, and he did wait till she was nearly 16 before he married her in 1782. But marry they did, and Miles Mason took on the entire business empire. He also became a freeman of the Glassellers Company in London in 1783, the same year that Ann Ruth was born, and established, along with some of his wholesale and retail colleagues in London, the China Club that met at the Globe Tavern on Fleet Street. And it was essentially an auction ring. It was established to try and control the cost and the prices paid for goods imported by the East India Company, which was highly illegal, so perhaps a less glamorous aspect of Miles Mason's business career. Miles Mason involved himself very much outside London, and he ended up with his business interests in Liverpool, taking precedent over his manufacturing interests. But like all of the business interests he had, they were established by Farrer and not by Miles Mason himself. The exception to that was manufacturing in Stoke-on-Trent. This is the Liverpool docks in the early part of the 19th century. Miles Mason's first business venture into manufacturing was in Liverpool, and he took two partners who were experienced in ceramics, and he began to make porcelains which replaced some of the stock in trade that he sold retail in London, namely porcelains decorated with Chinese-inspired designs, such as this teapot made in Liverpool in the late 1790s. He soon recognised, however, that Stoke-on-Trent and the potteries were centre of the ceramics industry, and he transferred his manufacturing interests to Lane Delph, now Fenton, in the potteries, where he took premises later to become known as the Victoria Works, seen here in a watercolour by Reginald Hagger on the right of the screen, with the house and works in quite close proximity to one another and a far cry from the very polite mansion that the family had been used to in Chigwell Row in Essex. And again, he began making very orientally inspired ceramics, and that continued throughout the lifetime of the business, both in Mason hands and then beyond, for about 200 years. So to focus on the family, Ruth Mason was born in 1767, and she outlived her husband by some years, dying in 1834. Her future was bound up mostly with her eldest son, William Mason, who is shown here at the top of this image from the family portrait. And they ended up both in Manchester, at addresses in Manchester together, where William had gone into trade. And then both Ruth Mason, her eldest son William, and then subsequently the second eldest son, George Miles Mason, were all buried here at Norbury Parish Church on the border between Derbyshire and Staffordshire. And this was unusual because Miles Mason, the family vault was actually at Barlaston, and that's where Miles Mason was buried and where Charles James Mason was also buried. And there has been speculation on a family rift, and I think it's quite likely that that was the case. And certainly Ruth appeared not to be living with her husband beyond about 1818 or thereabouts, 1816 perhaps. This is the monument within Norbury Parish Church in Derbyshire, which pays tribute to them. Ann Ruth Mason, we now do know the date of her death. We know that she was the eldest child of Ruth and Miles, born in 1783. So I set to find out what I could about her. The memoir of her very, very much younger niece, Florence Coyne, was written way after the death of Ann Ruth, and Florence herself was born many years after the death of Ann Ruth. But she relates that Annie married Captain Lesage, East India Company service, and went to India and died early. Reginald Hagger in his 1952 book, and then Hagger and Adams in their book of 1977, repeat the information that they found she was born on the 20th of May 1783, christened on the 24th of June at St Gabriel's, Fenchurch Street, London. They go on to say she married, 1799, at the age of 16 years, a Captain Lesage of the Indian Army. And then marriage notice in the Gentleman's Magazine of February 1801, 26th of February, Mr. B. Lesage to Miss Ann Ruth Mason of Liverpool. So there are more questions there than answers as far as I'm concerned. So I began to look a little bit further and for more evidence of Ann Ruth. It transpired that both accounts of her marriage, both in 1799 and in 1801, were quite correct. And in fact, Ann Ruth eloped. Aged 16, she ran off with a neighbour of the Masons from London, a Mr. Bibby Lesage, or sometimes Lesage, it depends which account you read. And they basically ran away together, very young. And then we find that they got married again, the same people, in 1801, and they're listed in the registers in Holborn. And what we think is that the families made the best of a bad job, fetched the pair home, and insisted that they marry correctly and in church. And here I've just illustrated the point by showing a transfer print, Gretna Green or the Red Hot Marriage, which appears on a creamware mug, derived from prints at the time where people were depicted running away to Gretna Green and being married by the blacksmith. So what about Bibby Lesage? I found that Bibby Lesage was one of many children of Augustus, or otherwise Augustine, and Diana Lesage. Augustus was a London goldsmith and jeweller, and he was also of Huguenot descent and was part of a family of silversmiths and goldsmiths renowned for the high quality of their work. His father, John Lesage, was subordinate goldsmith to the king, and the high standard Augustine's work reflects his father's skill. However, Bibby did not follow his father into this business. Bibby was listed as a coal merchant in one of the accounts of their marriage. Not the kind of calling that I think the Mason family would have liked for anyone to be marrying their daughter. However, it was probably a large-scale coal merchant's business, but we know very little about it. But what happened following their marriage is that he appears to have been brought a commission with the fleet of the East India Company, and Bibby became a lieutenant and then a captain in the East India Company, and he sailed with and then went on to be the protege of Sir Robert Townsend Farquhar, a baronet and influential British merchant of the early 19th century, and who served as a colonial governor and member of Parliament. And during his lengthy service for both the East India Company and the British government, he was governor of Mauritius from 1810 to 1823. He was the first governor under British rule following the overthrow of the French. Bibby himself lived in Mauritius, and we find that he'd remarried in Mauritius in 1815. Therefore, we suppose that Ann Ruth had died. In 1815, Bibby was invited to join the Mauritius Freemasons, and he was listed at that time as a merchant. I found no children of Ann Ruth, but I'm very grateful to others, and certainly it's not the fruits of my research, but we have found that there is the register of her death, and Ann Ruth died in 1810. I can't find any children at all from Bibby and Ann Ruth's marriage, and I don't think that we ever recorded Ann Ruth going to Mauritius. So the family history, the family tale of her going to live in India or otherwise abroad is probably quite incorrect. There is quite a lot of information about Bibby Lesage. Apparently he campaigned against slavery, but was himself a slave owner, which if you were living in Mauritius at that time, in the early part of the 19th century, was highly likely. And my next step is to find out a lot more about Bibby Lesage and what were his trading interests. So to summarise what we know about Ann Ruth and Ruth Mason, we found that Ann Ruth didn't have a long life. She died aged 27. There weren't any surviving children from her marriage to Bibby Lesage, but she did appear to have married for love. The portrait is fascinating as it shows her as the central figure in this family group, accompanied by what appears to be a deer on her left-hand side. And I found that in and around Essex, near Epping Forest, it was the habit for wealthy families to have pet deer. So this would explain a seemingly strange depiction of this deer within the family group. Ann Ruth doesn't appear to have been engaged at all with manufacturing industry or with wholesale trade or retail trade, which isn't surprising. Women generally didn't get involved unless through inheritance they were obliged to play a part in those sorts of businesses. So we know very little about her activities and what she was doing in her home life in Liverpool and London. Ruth Mason was the only surviving child of her father, Richard Farrar. She was very young when he died. She was a very late in life child to Richard Farrar, to a late marriage. So she would not have known her father particularly well. She appears to have had good trustees, and we know who these people are, but they did think that Miles Mason was a suitable husband, a suitable match for her, which by the circumstances of their marriage appears not to have been the case. And certainly Ruth Mason's fortunes were very much bound up with her eldest son, William, and she appears to have been living with William in Manchester from about 1816 or 18, and certainly the fact that they were buried together in Norbury Parish Church, along with George Miles Mason, says that there was a family rift, which is confirmed by that particular circumstance. We know very much more about the Mason men, and we know about the factories and their products, and there are a good number of books written about them. But it's fascinating to find information about family members that have been overlooked by history, and I look forward to finding out much more about this family.